There is a decision in intelligence work that has no clean name. Officers call it the trade. It is the moment when saving one person requires losing another, and both choices leave blood on the ledger. Most officers go their entire careers without facing it. The ones who do face it rarely speak about it afterward, not even to their own families. On a cold February morning in 2011, a senior Mossad case officer named Yonatan Barzal walked into a sealed room on the 4th floor of the Glilit complex north of Tel Aviv. No cameras, no recording devices, no note-takers. Only 3 chairs, a wooden table, and a single folder placed at its center. He had been called into that room 11 times in his 22-year career. He had never once refused what was inside. Yonatan was 46 years old. He had authorized surveillance on wedding parties in Cyprus. He had cleared operations in hospital corridors in Amman. He had signed off on tracking devices placed inside the school bags of children whose fathers built centrifuges. None of it had ever made him stop at a door. That morning, his hand rested on the handle for almost a full minute before he pushed it open. Later, colleagues would say they noticed nothing unusual about him that day. He drank his coffee. He spoke about his son's upcoming induction into the paratroopers. He complained about the traffic on Highway 4. Whatever happened inside that room, he carried out of it alone, and he carried it for the rest of his life. The folder contained 2 names. One belonged to a man Israel had been hunting for 9 years. The other belonged to a woman who had never harmed anyone in her life. By the end of the hour, Yonatan would have to decide which one lived and which one did not. The arithmetic of the folder was cruel, and it was clean. Saving the innocent woman meant losing the guilty man. Ending the guilty man meant abandoning the innocent woman to a fate she did not know was coming. There was no third path. There was no clever exit. There was only a pen, a folder, and a window that would close in 72 hours. What Yonatan did next has never appeared in any declassified record. The operation carries no official name. The woman does not exist in any public database. The man exists only as a footnote in a counter-proliferation summary, his death attributed to cardiac failure in a hotel room in Vienna. This is the story of what happened between those 2 lines. The story of a decision that saved one life by sacrificing another. And the reason Mossad has never explained why. Before we go further, here is something for you, because you clearly cannot get enough of stories like these. We put together a limited edition ebook, a collection of real operations where one officer sat alone with a folder and decided whose life was worth more than someone else's. The name written down, and the name quietly left off. The assets burned to protect strangers who never knew they had been saved. The cost carried by the one person who could never tell anyone. These are the trades that never made it into any record, declassified or otherwise. If this is the world you cannot look away from, this book is where it lives. Scan the QR code on the screen to grab your copy, or click the link in the description. Then stay with us, because this story is just getting started. To understand the folder on Yonatan's desk, you first have to understand the man whose name was written on the top line. His name was Farhad Nazari, though he had used at least 11 other names across 4 continents over the previous 2 decades. He was born in Isfahan in 1963, trained as a metallurgical engineer at Sharif University, and by the late 1990s he had become one of the most valuable procurement agents inside Iran's clandestine weapons supply chain. Farhad did not build bombs, he bought the parts that built them. Vacuum pumps from Germany. Miraging steel from Ukraine. Specialized aluminum alloys routed through a shell company in Johannesburg. Precision bearings from a machine shop in northern Italy. Anything Iran could not manufacture domestically, Farhad found a way to acquire, always through a chain of intermediaries that ended long before it reached his own hands. For 9 years, Mossad had chased him across the shadow economy of Europe. They knew his preferred hotels in Vienna and Geneva. They knew the pattern of his phone discipline, which was almost perfect. They knew he never met the same contact twice in the same city, and that he traveled with a small leather satchel that never left his side, not even in the shower. What they did not know was where he kept the master ledger, a single document that named every supplier, every shell company, every intermediary in his network. Kill Farhad without the ledger, and 100 other Farhads would rise to take his place within a year. The pipeline would reroute. The engineers would recruit new agents. The delay would be measured in months, not decades. But capture the ledger and Iran's covert supply chain would collapse for a decade. Every front company burned, every supplier compromised, every route mapped. That was the prize. That had always been the prize. The human anchor on this operation was Yonatan Barzel. He had been chasing Farhad since 2002. He had watched 3 younger officers burn out on the file and rotate off to other desks. He had missed his daughter's bat mitzvah for a surveillance rotation in Geneva that produced nothing. Farhad was, in the private language of the department, his ghost. The one that got away over and over in 7 different countries. Yonatan did not hate him. Hatred was for amateurs. What Yonatan felt was closer to the exhaustion of a chess player who has been staring at the same board for 9 years without checkmate. He knew Farhad's handwriting. He knew the brand of cigarettes Farhad had smoked before quitting in 2007. He knew the name of Farhad's mother, who had died in a nursing home in Tabriz in 2009 without ever seeing her son again. In some ways, Yonatan knew Farhad better than Farhad's own family did. Then, in late January of 2011, the board changed. A signals intercept from a listening post in Cyprus picked up a fragment of a call between Farhad and a contact in Damascus. The contact was arranging a meeting, not a procurement meeting, a personal one. Farhad had a daughter he had not seen in 19 years. Her name was Layla. She was 31 years old, a pediatric physician working in a refugee clinic in the southern outskirts of Beirut. She did not know her father was alive. She did not know his real name. She believed, as her mother had told her when she was 3 years old, that he had died in a car accident on the road between Tabriz and Zanjan. She had grown up with a photograph of a stranger on the mantelpiece. She had trained in medicine because her mother said her father had wanted her to be a healer. Everything she believed about him was a story built around an absence. The intercept revealed that Farhad had decided to break his own operational discipline for the first time in 9 years. He wanted to see her. He had arranged, through the Damascus contact, for a single meeting in a neutral city. Vienna, a hotel lobby. 40 minutes. He would tell her the truth about who he was, hand her a sealed envelope containing money and documents, and disappear again. It was the first mistake he had made in 9 years. And Mossad had heard every word of it. The tactical assessment came back within 36 hours, and it was unambiguous. Farhad would be alone in Vienna for approximately 72 hours. He would almost certainly be carrying the leather satchel, which the analysts now believed with high confidence contained the master ledger. He would be, for the first time in nearly a decade, predictable. The window to act was narrow. The intelligence gain was incalculable. The operation was approved at the highest level within 48 hours of the intercept landing on the desk, but the folder on Yonatan's desk contained a second name, and the second name was the problem. Because the analysts had also learned something else about Layla during their preparation. Something that had not been in the original intercept. Something that transformed the arithmetic of the operation from a straightforward procurement kill into something Yonatan had never seen in 22 years of service. Layla was already under surveillance, not by Mossad, by someone else, someone who had been watching her for 6 months, someone who had already, in a signed memorandum, decided what would happen to her the moment she crossed the Lebanese border. And when Yonatan closed the folder and set his pen down on the table, only one question mattered. Who else was waiting for her in Vienna? The name at the top of the second memorandum was one Yonatan had seen before. It belonged to a colonel in the Iranian Ministry of Intelligence and Security named Hossein Rahimi. a counter-espionage officer who ran a small unit dedicated to identifying and eliminating what Tehran called external threats to the revolution abroad. Rahimi's unit did not answer to the ministry's Foreign Operations Desk. It answered directly to a subcommittee of the Supreme National Security Council, and its budget did not appear in any accounting document that had ever crossed a Western analyst's desk. For 6 months, Rahimi's unit had been building a file on Layla Nazari. They had photographed her entering and leaving the refugee clinic in the southern outskirts of Beirut. They had catalogued her patients, most of whom were Syrian children displaced by the civil war on the other side of the border. They had tracked her weekly visits to a pharmacy in the Hamra district and her monthly dinners with an aunt in the Burj Hamout neighborhood. They had built a life on paper, and they had reached the wrong conclusion about all of it. The pharmacy where Layla collected medical supplies for the clinic was owned by a man whose brother had once been a mid-level logistics officer in Hezbollah. The brother had died in 2009. The pharmacy owner had no operational connection to anything. But Rahimi's unit did not know that. They saw a pediatric physician making regular visits to a pharmacy with a Hezbollah-adjacent ownership history, and they built a theory around it. In their theory, Layla was a courier. Her medical bag was the delivery mechanism. The refugee children were the cover. Everything in the theory was wrong. Layla had never met a Hezbollah operative in her life. She did not know the pharmacy owner's family history. She had chosen the pharmacy because it was 3 blocks from the clinic and because the owner gave her a discount on pediatric antibiotics that the clinic could not otherwise afford. But Rahimi did not know any of that. And Rahimi was not in the business of asking questions when a theory felt clean enough to act on. The memorandum that Mossad had intercepted 9 days before Yonatan walked into the sealed room contained a single operational directive. Layla Nazari was to be eliminated the moment she left Lebanese territory. Vienna would be the opportunity. The method would be a poison contact agent applied to a door handle in her hotel room. The cause of death would present as a sudden cardiac event in a woman with no known heart condition. Rahimi's unit had done this before. They were good at it. There would be no autopsy that could contradict the finding, because the Austrian authorities would have no reason to look. Yonatan sat in the sealed room and read the memorandum 3 times. He understood, with a clarity that felt like a physical weight settling on his chest, what the arithmetic actually was. If Mossad moved on Farhad in Vienna, Rahimi's unit would move on Layla within hours of her arrival. She would die in her hotel room, or in a taxi, or on a quiet street 2 blocks from a coffee shop, and no one would ever know why. If Mossad warned her, they would burn the Cyprus intercept, expose the listening post, and lose their only window on Farhad. And if they did nothing at all, Farhad would meet his daughter, hand her the envelope, disappear for another decade, and Layla would still die. Because Rahimi had already decided. He set the folder aside and walked to the window. The Glilit complex looked out over a stretch of eucalyptus trees and beyond them the coastal highway. He thought about his own daughter, who was now 23 and studying architecture in Haifa. He thought about what it would mean to know that a father you had never met was in the next room, and that the reason you had never met him was that he had spent his entire adult life building the machinery that might one day be used to kill you. He did not know what he would want in her place. He did not know what any of them would want. The abort discussion happened the next morning in a conference room 3 floors below the sealed room. 4 people were present. Yonatan, the head of the Counterproliferation Directorate, a woman named Ruth Halevi, a legal advisor whose name does not appear in any surviving record, and a 4th man from the Prime Minister's office who sat at the end of the table and said almost nothing for the first 40 minutes. Ruth opened the meeting by laying out the operational case. 9 years of work. A ledger that would collapse the Iranian procurement network for a decade. A window that would not reopen. She spoke for 11 minutes, and when she finished, she looked at Yonatan and asked him for his assessment. Yonatan said, quietly, that he wanted to discuss the abort option. Ruth's expression did not change, but the legal advisor set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, and the man from the Prime Minister's office looked up for the first time. The abort option was simple in structure and impossible in practice. Cancel the Vienna operation. Continue passive surveillance on Farhad. Wait for another window. Warn Layla through a cutout, without revealing the source. Accept the loss of 9 years of work in exchange for 2 lives that were, in the accounting of the state, not directly Israel's responsibility. Yonatan laid it out in 3 minutes. Ruth listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked him one question. She asked him how many Iranian centrifuges he thought Farhad's ledger was worth, and how many Israeli lives those centrifuges would eventually cost if the ledger walked out of Vienna in a leather satchel. Yonatan did not have an answer. He had spent 9 years chasing Farhad precisely because he believed the ledger was worth almost any price. That was the entire premise of the file. That was why he had missed his daughter's bat mitzvah. Now, sitting in a conference room with a memorandum in front of him that named an innocent woman as the incidental cost of finally closing the file, he found that the arithmetic he had believed in for 9 years no longer added up cleanly. But he could not say that. He could not say it because he did not know if it was true, or if it was only exhaustion, or if it was the accumulated weight of every folder he had ever signed without hesitating at the door. The legal advisor spoke next. He said the operation was clean under Israeli law. He said the operation was clean under the operational guidelines that governed foreign counter-proliferation activity. He said that what happened to Layla Nazari at the hands of a foreign intelligence service was not, in any legal framework that applied to their work, Israel's responsibility. He said this in the flat administrative voice of a man reading the temperature off a thermometer. Then he stopped and looked at the man from the Prime Minister's office, who nodded once, and the legal advisor closed his folder. The man from the Prime Minister's office spoke for the first time. He said 3 sentences. He said that the operation was approved. He said that Yonatan had operational authority over the field team and full discretion over the tactical execution. And he said that if there was a way to complete the primary mission while also preventing what Rahimi's unit intended to do to Layla Nazari, no one in the room would object to Yonatan finding it. Then he stood up and left the room, and the meeting was over. Yonatan walked back to his office in the fading light of the afternoon and closed the door. He sat at his desk for a long time before he opened the folder again, and when he did, he read the pencil notation in the margin for the 4th time, the one he had noticed the day before and set aside, because he could not yet see the shape of what it was asking him to do. Now, in the quiet of the empty office, he read it slowly, and he understood. The notation proposed a 4th option that no one in the abort meeting had mentioned aloud. It was not a warning to Layla. It was not a cancellation of the Vienna operation. It was something else. Something that used the Iranian surveillance on Layla as the mechanism of her survival, rather than the mechanism of her death. The reframe was this. Rahimi's unit did not know that Layla was Farhad's daughter. They believed she was a Hezbollah courier. If Mossad could feed them a piece of intelligence through a channel Rahimi trusted that revealed Layla's actual identity, everything changed. Because Rahimi's unit did not eliminate the daughters of senior procurement agents without authorization from a level of the Security Council that would require weeks of internal debate. Layla would still be under surveillance. She would still be watched. But she would not be killed, because killing her would create a political problem for Rahimi's superiors that Rahimi did not have the standing to solve. The intelligence would have to be delivered before Layla crossed the Lebanese border. It would have to come from a source Rahimi believed was inside Israeli intelligence, because any other source would trigger a verification process that would take longer than the window allowed, which meant that Mossad would have to burn an asset, a real one. Someone who had spent years building a legend inside a channel that Rahimi's unit occasionally tapped. Once the intelligence was delivered, the asset would be exposed within weeks, and the asset would not survive the exposure. Yonatan read the notation one more time. Then he sat back in his chair and closed his eyes. because he understood now what the folder had been asking him all along. It had never been a choice between Farhad and Layla. It had been a choice between Layla and someone else. Someone whose name was not in the folder. Someone he would have to select himself. And the question he could not stop turning over, as the light outside his window faded and the eucalyptus trees darkened against the sky, was whether the asset he was about to sacrifice would have agreed to it, if anyone had ever thought to ask. The asset's name was Reuven. That was not his real name, and Yonatan had never known his real name. But he had known Reuven for 11 years. Reuven was a 53-year-old Iranian Jew who had left Tehran in 1979 as a teenager and returned, under a different identity, in 1994. For 17 years he had lived in a small apartment in the northern part of the city, working as a translator for a state-adjacent publishing house and passing information out through a channel that Rahimi's unit occasionally intercepted and treated as reliable. He was not a courier. He was not a saboteur. He was a piece of infrastructure, invisible and slow and precise, and losing him would create a hole in Mossad's Iranian coverage that would take a decade to fill. Yonatan chose him because there was no one else who fit. The intelligence about Layla had to come from a source Rahimi's unit already trusted, and Reuven's channel was the only one that met the requirement inside the window. Yonatan understood what he was doing when he wrote Reuven's cryptonym on the operational planning sheet, and he understood it again when he passed the sheet to Ruth Halavi the next morning without saying anything. And Ruth read the cryptonym and did not say anything either, and both of them understood that they had just agreed to something that neither of them could name aloud. The Vienna team was assembled in 48 hours. 4 officers. 2 of them had worked with Yonatan before. The other 2 he had never met. The plan was straightforward on paper. Farhad would arrive at the Intercontinental on the Johannesgas on the evening of February 21st. Layla would arrive at a smaller hotel 3 blocks away, the Astoria, the following morning. The meeting was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon in the lobby of the Sasher. The team would take Farhad in his own room at the Intercontinental during the 40-minute window when he left the satchel unattended to shower before the meeting. Cardiac agent. Applied to the towel rack. He would be dead within 9 minutes. The satchel would leave the hotel in a laundry cart. The intelligence about Layla's identity was passed to Reuven's channel on the morning of February 19th. It was worded carefully. It did not name Mossad. It named a mid-level analyst inside a Western European intelligence service that Rahimi's unit had penetrated 18 months earlier. The intelligence stated that the woman Rahimi's unit had been surveilling for 6 months was not a Hezbollah courier. She was the estranged daughter of a senior Iranian procurement agent operating under the cover name Farhad Nazari. The intelligence recommended that any action against her be suspended pending review at the Security Council level. Reuven passed it through the channel at 11:14 in the morning, Tehran time. He did not know what it meant. He was not supposed to. Yonatan flew to Vienna that evening on a commercial flight through Frankfurt. He arrived at the Safe House, a 4th-floor apartment in the Neubau district, at just past midnight. The team was already there. They had rented the apartment through a shell company that owned 3 others in the same building. The windows looked out over a courtyard where an old woman fed pigeons every morning at 7. Yonatan slept for 4 hours and woke before dawn to find one of the officers he did not know sitting at the kitchen table, drinking coffee, watching him. The officer's name was Dana. She was 31 years old, formerly of the paratroopers, and she had been read into the operation only partially. She knew about Farhad. She did not know about Layla. She did not know about Reuven. She looked at Yonatan across the table and asked him, quietly, if there was anything about the operation that she should know that was not in her briefing. Yonatan looked at her for a long moment, and then he said no, and he understood as he said it that he had just crossed a line he could not walk back from. Because whatever happened in the next 36 hours, he was now the only person in Vienna who knew all of it. Farhad arrived at the Intercontinental at 7:40 in the evening on February 21st, exactly as predicted. He was traveling under a Belgian passport in the name of Henri Devos. He checked in, took the elevator to the 7th floor, entered room 714, and did not leave for the rest of the night. The team watched the door from a service corridor 2 floors up, using a fiber optic camera fed through the ventilation system. The satchel did not leave his hand once, not even when he ate dinner in the room from a tray brought up by the hotel restaurant. The near abort came at 4:17 the following morning. The intercept from Cyprus, still running, caught a fragment of a call from Rahimi's unit to an operator in Damascus. The fragment was incomplete. It suggested that the intelligence about Layla had reached the desk it was supposed to reach, but it also suggested that the desk was moving slowly. The action against Layla had not been formally suspended. It had only been paused for review. And the pause could be lifted at any time. Jonathan sat in the safe house kitchen at 4:30 in the morning and read the intercept summary 3 times. The team leader, an officer named Gadi, who had worked with him for 8 years, sat across the table and waited. The question in the room was whether to proceed. If Rahimi's unit lifted the pause before Layla crossed the border, the entire architecture of the 4th option collapsed. Reuven would be exposed for nothing. Layla would die. Farhad would still be killed, but the ledger might not survive the aftermath. Because a dead daughter would trigger a chain of internal Iranian investigations that would identify the Vienna window as the point of compromise, and might reach the Cyprus listening post before the ledger could be exploited. Gadi asked Jonathan what he wanted to do. Jonathan did not answer for almost 2 minutes. Then he said proceed. And Gadi nodded once without asking anything else and stood up to brief the team. Layla crossed the Lebanese border at 9:40 in the morning. She flew from Beirut to Vienna via Istanbul, arriving at Schwechat Airport at 22 minutes past 2 in the afternoon local time. She was 2 hours late. Her connecting flight from Istanbul had been delayed by weather. The meeting at the Sasher had been rescheduled by a coded text message from Farhad's contact in Damascus to 5 in the afternoon. Farhad received the reschedule notification at 10:41 in the morning and remained in his room, reading. He did not shower until 4:15. The team took him at 4:17. The cardiac agent was applied to the towel rack. He collapsed in the bathroom at 4:23. The satchel was in the closet, exactly where the surveillance had predicted. It was in the laundry cart and out of the hotel by 4:31. The team was clear of Vienna by 6 that evening. Layla arrived at the Satcher at 4:58. She waited in the lobby for 1 hour and 40 minutes. She ordered a coffee. She checked her phone repeatedly. She did not know that the man she was waiting for was already dead, 4 blocks away, in a hotel room that had not yet been reported to the front desk. At 6:40, she left the Satcher and walked back to the Astoria. She did not know she was being followed. She did not know that the pause on her elimination had been extended, sometime that afternoon, by a decision made at a level of the Iranian Security Council that Rahimi did not have the standing to overrule. She flew back to Beirut the following morning. She was watched at the airport. She was watched on the flight. She was watched at her apartment for another 6 weeks. And then, slowly, the surveillance thinned, and eventually it stopped, and she went back to her clinic and her patients and her weekly visits to the pharmacy, and she never knew any of it had happened. The false release came 3 days later in Tel Aviv. Jonathan received the confirmation that the ledger had been exploited. 61 front companies identified. 17 suppliers compromised, a network map that stretched across 4 continents. Ruth Halevi called him into her office and told him it was the most significant counterproliferation gain in a decade. She shook his hand. He walked out of her office and down to the parking garage and sat in his car for a long time before he drove home. Because the confirmation he was waiting for had not come yet. The one about Reuven. That confirmation would arrive 9 days later. And when it did, it would not be the confirmation he had hoped for. The Counterproliferation Directorate spent the first 72 hours after Vienna in a state of quiet celebration. The ledger was clean. The intelligence value exceeded every projection Ruth Halevi's team had put on paper. 61 front companies were mapped in the first 48 hours. 17 suppliers were identified with enough specificity that European liaison services could be discreetly notified without exposing the source. A machine shop in northern Italy that had been supplying precision bearings under a falsified end-use certificate was raided by Italian financial police within 9 days, on a tip that appeared to originate from a tax audit. The Austrian authorities recorded Henri Devos as a Belgian businessman who had suffered a fatal cardiac event in his hotel room. The body was released to a Belgian consular officer who did not exist, transported to a facility outside Vienna, and cremated 3 days later. There was no autopsy. There were no questions. The Intercontinental replaced the towel rack in room 714 as part of a routine renovation 11 months later, and no one on the housekeeping staff ever noticed anything unusual about the room in the intervening period. Inside Iran, the response was slower and stranger than Yonatan had expected. For the first 6 days after Vienna, there was silence. No public acknowledgement, no internal panic that Mossad's monitoring could detect. Farhad's disappearance was absorbed into the machinery of the procurement network the way a stone is absorbed into a pond, with a small ripple and then nothing. The engineers who had depended on him for parts began, quietly, to look for new intermediaries. The network did not collapse in a day. It began to hollow out, slowly, in the way that infrastructure fails when the person who understood how it worked is no longer there to hold it together. Rahimi's unit received the news of Farhad's death on the 7th day. The internal memorandum that followed, which Mossad intercepted 11 days later, did not connect Farhad to Layla. It treated the two files as unrelated. The pause on Layla's elimination was extended to a formal suspension, and then, quietly, the file was closed without ever being resolved. Rahimi did not know that the woman he had been preparing to kill was the daughter of the man whose ledger had just been extracted from a hotel room in Vienna. He never found out. As far as any surviving record indicates, he went to his own retirement 4 years later, still believing that Layla Nazari had been a Hezbollah courier whose file had simply been reassigned to a different desk. The confirmation about Reuven arrived on the 9th day. It came through a channel Mossad maintained inside the Iranian judicial system, in the form of a routine notification that a translator at a state-adjacent publishing house had been detained for questioning in connection with an unspecified security matter. There was no charge. There was no trial that Yonatan would ever see documented. There was only the detention notification, and then, 3 weeks later, a second notification that the detainee had died during interrogation. The cause of death was listed as cardiac failure. Yonatan read the second notification in his office in Tel Aviv on a Tuesday morning in mid-March and did not move for a long time. He had known this was the likely outcome when he wrote Reuven's cryptonym on the operational planning sheet. He had known it when he passed the sheet to Ruth Halevi. He had known it every hour of every day since the Vienna operation ended. But knowing something and receiving its confirmation are not the same thing, and the notification on his desk that morning was the difference between an abstraction and a fact. Reuven had a wife in Tehran. He had 2 adult children who did not know what their father actually did for a living. None of them would ever be told the truth. They would be told that he had died of a heart attack in state custody, and they would be left to build the rest of the story themselves. The Iranian procurement network took 11 years to rebuild to the capacity it had possessed on the morning Farhad walked into the Intercontinental in Vienna. That was the strategic gain, and by every measure Ruth Halevi's directorate had ever used to justify a counter-proliferation operation, it was decisive. Centrifuge production slowed. Component acquisition became more expensive, more visible, and more prone to interception. The engineers who inherited Farhad's role were less experienced, less patient, and less careful, and their mistakes provided Mossad with intelligence streams for years afterward that would not have existed if Farhad had lived. But the loss of Reuven's channel created a hole in Iranian coverage that was not filled during Yonatan's remaining years in the service. The publishing house Reuven had worked for was audited internally, and 3 other channels that had operated in adjacent institutions were rolled up over the following 18 months as a precaution. The total intelligence loss, measured in streams that went dark between 2011 and 2014, exceeded what any single procurement gain could offset. The Counterproliferation Directorate had won a decisive battle. The broader Iran desk had lost something quieter and longer, and the 2 ledgers did not reconcile. Layla Nazari continued to work at the refugee clinic in the southern outskirts of Beirut for another 6 years. She never learned that her father had been alive until 3 weeks before she was supposed to meet him. She never learned that he had died in a hotel room in Vienna while she waited for him in a coffee shop 4 blocks away. She never learned that a translator in Tehran had died in a state facility so that she could go back to her patients and her weekly visits to the pharmacy and her monthly dinners with her aunt in Burj Hammoud. She lived, and she did not know at whose expense. Yonatan Barzel remained in the service for another 7 years. He was promoted twice. He was awarded a decoration that he was not permitted to display or discuss outside the sealed rooms in which it was presented. He retired in 2018 at the age of 53, quietly, without a ceremony, and moved with his wife to a small town in the Galilee. He does not give interviews. He does not attend the reunions that former case officers occasionally organize. When asked, on the rare occasions he is asked, what he did during his years in the service, he says that he worked in analysis. What the operation cost him was not the sleep, which he had already surrendered years earlier, and not the marriage, which had already survived worse things. What it cost him was the belief that the arithmetic could ever fully add up. He had spent 9 years believing that the ledger was worth almost any price, and he had discovered, in a sealed room on a February morning, that the price was not a number he could calculate in advance. It was a name he had to write himself, on a planning sheet, and pass across a desk to a woman who understood exactly what he was doing and did not stop him. He carried the weight of that decision alone, because there was no one in the service who could share it with him, and no one outside the service he could tell. Vienna was not built in a sealed room. It was built on a doctrine that predated Yonatan's career by decades. The quiet operational logic that says one life may be traded for another when the arithmetic runs a certain way, and that the person doing the trading will carry it alone. That doctrine did not begin with Farhad, and it did not end with him. The cases that shaped it are not in any public file. Some of them are in the ebook linked in the description below. An operational record of the trades Mossad made in the shadows, the assets burned to save unknowing civilians, and the ledgers no one outside the sealed rooms was ever meant to read. The document is in the description if you want to see the rest of the record. If you had been the officer in that sealed room, with a pen in your hand and a folder in front of you, and you understood that saving one life meant sacrificing another, which name would you have written on the planning sheet? Tell us in the comments.